I've got the difficult task now of trying to make some connections between these three papers, so I think I'm going to do that first by just explaining that this is a rather more theoretical paper, where I'm going to take these concepts which have been appearing in the other papers, sharing, conviviality, and to theorise these concepts together through reference to sustainable degrowth. And the connection point really with the previous papers, as I was listening, was very much about the fact that a lot of theories take sharing as practices or conviviality as co-presence. And I'm really going to emphasise a much more dynamic, and this is not going to work, this is, I'm sorry, it's a, well, I wanted to move around, but I'll have to use a handheld, yeah. Yeah, this is the problem with coming as a last paper, because I also want you to use this as well. Okay. So as I say, I want to deal with these as dynamic processes of learning. No, it's all right, I've got this. It would have been better to have the headset on. So this is quite an ambitious paper, and I'm assure you I'm not going to be reading from all this. I've put a lot of text on to help those people who are English as second language. I'm going to basically go through what is quite an ambitious sort of set of theoretical connections that I've been making in my work recently. And I'm going to signpost where I think I deviate from what I think of as being quite static, maybe practice-based theories. So I'm going to start from a very familiar point for most of us here, and that is to challenge conventional celebration of growth. So I'm going to start from the problem of growth, and then I'm going to focus on this idea of living together, the living togetherness of intentional community, as a path out of capitalism. And I'm going to spell out that actually it's multiple paths that I'm looking at through my research. With reference in passing to sustainable degrowth theory, and also theories of conviviality. In particular, an inspirational reference point is the work of Ivan Illich and his tools for conviviality, which is looking at work beyond the logic of wages and debt. So I want to argue that intentional communities demonstrate practices, but more importantly, I'm not about describing the intentional communities I'm about to refer to. I'm really exploring, through comparative research, a much deeper understanding of the creative processes, the ongoing, the becoming that we've been hearing about. So, I'm not going to move through this slide in any detail other than to say that starting with the problem of growth is to move away from the celebration of a very narrow definition of growth, where there's a vicious cycle. Anders Hayden has talked a lot about the lock-in effects of wage employment that promotes that narrow economic growth. GDP naturalises a system of household livelihood based on continuous, lifelong, maximum employment. It promotes individual rather than collective service provision. We see this in roads, we see this in serviced housing, such as private housing and all the private possessions and storage facilities associated with this lifestyle. If you think of any conventional house, you think in terms of all the white goods, consumer goods that are locked in for infrequent use in terms of individual privatised homes. That's the problem of growth, as much as conventional images we see of congestion, pollution, waste, hypermodernity, the speeding up of daily life, packing more activities into the day through using information and communication technology. So we take the problem of growth as a starting point. Then we want to challenge that, and this has been the work of a number of theorists over some time. But my argument is going to be that intentional communities, the living togetherness, offers a path out of capitalism. But it's not always completely or successfully enabled. Now, I'm focusing on the theory in this paper rather than too much of the empirical material, so I can only flag up through my research in Australia and briefly in an example from Denmark how this is realised in practice. because the purpose of the paper is actually to tell you that it's not about looking at intentional communities for particular practices or comparing better or worse practices, but really understanding and teasing out this experimental becoming and being and doing, as the other papers have said very cogently too. And so that's why I wanted to flag up this comment by Andre Gors here, this idea that he calls upon scholars and activists to maximise the number of paths out of capitalism. And I think his phrase is very illustrative here, in the sense of a biblical exodus that invents its own promised lands as it goes along. Now for me, this really resonates with what I've seen in, and my research has now encompassed more than 100 intentional communities across Australia, the United States, Scandinavia, Northern Europe, and into the UK. It resonates with the experimentation, the sense of thinking through pragmatic utopianism, the quest, the yearning, the striving, the being. These are all unfinished processes. So there are multiple paths out of capitalism in this sense. So I read this as being about creating and learning and being and doing. And I may also make the point that my approach has also been about embracing a pragmatic utopian approach, where what I've noticed, and you'll see in a moment, that my research has focused on the kind of particular epochs of intentional communities from the 1970s and onwards, that there's a shift in the present time to being engaged with education and engagement, again a link with the previous papers. And this is a very welcome and open tendency in intentional communities, as compared to the critique in previous times that in, say, the 1970s, intentional communities tended to divert marginal spaces to alternatives outside the mainstream. And so my spectrum of intentional communities I've observed have included, from the more radical to the more mainstream maybe, communities that have sometimes been disparaged in, certainly within my own discipline, in social geography, disparaged maybe as being less than radical. I'm thinking particularly of co-housing or group houses and shared cooperatives. When you take my perspective, where you're looking at the learning process of the creative experimentation, then these are just as richly intentional, and their focus on intentionality is just as relevant as it is the more radical communities. There are a number of ways of opposing the celebration of growth, particularly a body of research by sustainable degrowth theorists. Again, I'm just going to summarise here by saying that opposing the celebration of growth highlights the negative attendance of growth. It builds upon a limits to growth thesis, but it goes much beyond that. Crucial is the goal of sufficiency rather than unlimited growth. Crucial also is an understanding that standards of living can be maintained and improved through greater resource efficiency, coupled with a shift in culture and behaviour, hence the learning and being and doing differently and experimenting. And degrowth theorists support an extension of human relations instead of market relations, and that's really critical in the research that I undertake, where there's a deepening of democracy. So, I'm not going to elaborate on each of these, but there are, just in terms of the literature review in this area, four broad areas, different perspectives of theorising sustainable degrowth. Ethnic development, that focuses on the lessons from the global south, social justice, political ecology, and perhaps most pertinent to what I've been looking at in the other papers today is a sense of the post-material social movements that collectively are expressing disaffection with a culture based on the dominant market economy. But I would just flag up, because I'm very short of time here, so I'm just going to flag up this one point here, which again draws out this emphasis on process, not practice. Because social justice arguments, theories of sustainable degrowth, they employ degrowth not as a means to an end, sorry, not an end in itself, but as a means to break this link in our mainstream economic discourse of consumer citizenship between democracy and short-term economic interests. And a really good example of this is this idea of a temporal shift. And again, the link with the previous paper that I heard resonate for me was this temporality, the shift in time. Damanhurian time is about the time of becoming. But a social justice degrowth time is about ethical, being ethical as opposed to making ethical choices. Often we hear a language where choice is considered to be democracy and freedom. But if it's about an Aristotelian virtues-based ethic of being ethical, then we shift not only from choice, individual choices to collective action, but we can shift the whole frame of understanding growth. And that was kind of why I wanted to refer to this particular slide. But, and apologies, this is the last sort of tranche of theory that I think is important to make this transition from a kind of conventional theorising growth and contested growth to a more dynamic and process-based way of theorising degrowth, is I believe that the previous paradigms that I just outlined are all in themselves important but not sufficient to capture the process and the integrated process and the complexity. And therefore I've drawn on ways of theorising conviviality. This is familiar to many of you, I'm sure, but it begins with co-presence and the work of George Simmel, which is a sort of classic of his time, where George Simmel pointed to the universal occurrence in human development of a social pleasure of the physical company of others. We're all here today. Much of Findhorn is, I know, about spirituality, but it's also about people coming together in humanity. And he called this form of co-presence Geselligkeit, and apologies to any German speakers in the room if I'm mispronouncing that. To Simmel, the virtue of Geselligkeit is that interaction, encounter and engagement can run much, much deeper than simply social interaction as a fleeting interaction. Now, co-presence is one of 5 ways that I've identified of theorising this pleasurable encounter. Others that many will be familiar with here is the sort of community glue of Diane Leaf Christian's work. There's a function of sharing, living togetherness, and this has a very transformational potential in terms of challenging overconsumption. It links to the voluntary simplicity references in the first paper today. But it's also bound up in solidarity economies. So it's a way of marrying up the social and the economic. And then there's the tools of conviviality of Ivan Illich's work, which is very much about relocalizing craft production to challenge global competitiveness. The final 2 are references to sort of civic solidarity and human nature interdependency, but it's the top 3 that really are most relevant to the way I've used conviviality. So I've got so many things to juggle here, holding my hand up. I'm going to only provide a couple of snapshots from my research today because I wanted to set up this theory, this theoretical framework as a prelude to that. But just suffice to say that the research I'm drawing on today is part of a much bigger project, international, but also here just the Australian research covers 16 communities in 4 states. I've anonymised these and I've also organised them according to their epochs of countercultural origin. So I'm just going to show you in a moment a snapshot of the sort of legacy from the Northern Rivers region of Australia, what's called the Rainbow region. And these are multiple occupancy communities that emerged out of the sort of festival age of Asturias, in 1973 in this area. But I did other research which was the more recent communities, representing a shift from very much a sort of rural back to the land countercultural movement through to peri-urban and urban co-housing settlements. In very shortest time, I realised from previous papers. So just going to literally highlight the fact that I'm going to draw out some legacy, cultural legacy learning from this rainbow region in North, the Northern Ribbons case study area in Dutch Editions, home of the Bunjalong. And I wanted to draw particular attention to this region because what arguably defines the region even today is the legacy of one of the Nimbin Aquarius Festival in 1973, when hundreds of festival goers remained in the area, inspired to, and I quote one of my interviewees, create ecologically oriented community life through sharing resources and making low-cost housing a reality for those on a limited income. Now, at first, the multiple occupancies throughout this area, suppose we've got a cluster there, most of these were illegal squats or illegal multiple occupancies, but they subsequently became legal. And some of these, including one of the communities that I interviewed, accommodated as many as 250 adults and children in 100 small holdings. And these contemporary maps illustrate the extent of development, and in large part it's testimony to the scattering of these rural hamlets out of the area. I'm not going to be running close to. Oh, it's okay, so I'm very conscious that you've overrun so far. So what we'll also do is draw out from just a selection of these communities some of the key findings that I want to focus for the theoretical framework on sharing, the tools for conviviality, and sustainable degrowth. So there is a rich evidence of sharing across the sample, not only shared rituals and shared meals, as we've heard about in the previous papers, but three types of sharing in particular that I think show the foundations of sustainable degrowth. There's sharing based on co-presence, sharing physical space as neighbours. There's also affiliation, believing in common goals. And there's instrumental sharing, which is task-oriented reciprocal sharing. And that was evident in all the communities. But Ivan Illich uses the term conviviality in opposition to industrial productivity. And there's evidence that his tools are also present in these communities. The concept resonates with transitional theory, appropriate technology, and arguments advanced by sustainable degrowth theorists. And these tools facilitate autonomous and creative engagement among persons and between people and their environment. Key to what I set up in the start of the paper is that these create an environment in which members have access to autonomy and creativity, not least the opportunity to experiment in ways of sharing and ways of being together in a pleasurable, congregative environment, much as we're experiencing here at Findhorn. So these tools are clearly evident in the communities observed, particularly those in the 1970s. But some of the tools that are observed from these early communities are under threat, not least because of the scattered rural settlement types. The sources of support that are most frequently cited focus on caregiving and care receiving, but support also flows through circuits of learning, and this facilitates the changes necessary in behaviour to consume less, and also, for many, to rely on reduced commutes. But this is where we see some of the challenges in the communities I observed. The findings do reveal how social and material circuits of support intersect with a crucial sense of purpose, the intentionality, the becoming, not becoming in the way of becoming Damanhurian perhaps, but certainly a sense of purpose. And as one focus group participant said in one of the more recent communities emerging from the early 1990s, it's not enough, this living togetherness, this co-presence, this conviviality, it's not enough for people to live together to make the transition to a reduced consumption lifestyle, unless they are seeking a purpose. When an intentional community loses that sense of purpose that they began with, there's this lazy tendency for them to head back to a sort of suburban urbanism or rural suburbia. And what I wanted, what I was previously showing with this table here was that actually some of the conditions in which the 1970s communities had emerged have been eroded over time. Access to cheap land, opportunities to build low-impact dwellings very cheaply. So, for instance, one resident said that the tools of conviviality back in the 1970s were dirt cheap, expanded hand-built houses, organic gardens, craft industries, which replaced full-time lifelong employment and long mortgages with material and service costs of less than $2,000 per household per dwelling. Now, the conditions that were ripe, the tools of conviviality for those there, were being eroded. So what we were finding in the later communities was a sense in which the purpose was being challenged by the what Ivan Illich would say would be the disabling factors of this wage-based economy, mortgage debt, and lifelong employment. So the conclusions from those observations here is that sustainable degrowth was essentially also bound up in geography of context. So some of the smaller communities, the rural back to the land communities that had originally set up on a very cheap, low-cost basis were under threat because they were unable to counter the lock-in effects of wage employment, and they were unable to complete the transition to sustainable degrowth. And so that's what I'm wanting to, I'm going to just skip, I'll come back to that in just a moment. And just wanted to make a point, because I'm going to run out of time, that one of the things I looked at was the relationship between individual intentional communities and wider pan-community networks. And one thing I found out was that it was very important for communities to cluster together and collaborate beyond their individual community. So sustainable degrowth is not something that can be geographically located in one community. It's part of a wider web of, again, what Illich was called the community of communes, so wider clusters. Very, very briefly, I just want to just highlight the iconic case of Christiania in Denmark, which is where I've also spent an extended period of research. And I'm only going to do so to draw on this one quote, because I haven't got the time for anything else. Christiania is iconic. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with. Has anyone been to Christiania? Okay, yeah. There are some visual parallels with Findorn. This is my first visit to Findorn, and I was very interested to see what the similarities would be. Aesthetically, it's probably more grunge than it is eco-village, and it's still got that kind of really quite anarchic feel to it. But it's over its 40-year history, from squatter settlement to its current state of having effectively bought itself to be free from state harassment, it's had to strengthen its sense of purpose, and also it's had to struggle with its very unwieldy governance structure. Rizenga Mangizi recently gave a TEDx presentation, which was a very, very powerful inspiration to me in terms of sustainable degrowth theorisation and rhetoric. He was talking about the Christiania way of life, this Christiania way, and he talked about sharing in a way that I hadn't really thought of before. And again, this is really to culminate the paper, saying that sharing isn't about sharing practice, it's about learning, it's about openness to think very differently. And he summed up that sharing what Christiania had had to come to learn itself the hard way through this very painful process, was that if we have freedom to express ourselves, freedom to be who we are, and freedom to take our time, then we can break through to unexpected creative solutions. And the creative solution that Christiania broke through to after this period of struggle with the state was realising that whilst Christiania is based on an absence of private ownership, nobody owns their own home, all the property is is collectively owned, not owned, it's part of the open space. When confronted with the state-imposed normalisation, basically Christiania decided to, concluded in consensus, to buy the area free but not to own it. And that creative solution came out of not a traditional decision-making, but through a felt and lived sharing process that catalysed around this state of becoming. And it also came about subsequently through an issue of folk shares, raising money through crowd funding and the like. That's just an overview of how complex and how beautiful I think Christiania is. So in conclusion, and I'm not going to spell out all of these because I think the sort of take-home message of this is that I think that current theories of sustainable degrowth are inadequate or insufficient without really deconstructing what we mean by sharing and what we mean by living togetherness, conviviality by any other name. And I've started to deconstruct those through the many, many intervention communities that I've been visiting, some of them living with, over a number of years. But in particular, I've looked at some of the challenges from established communities and those that are forming today, where what's at stake is not so much the how-to from a toolkit manual, but actually a becoming, a being and a doing, a process which is very bound up in the interpersonal capacity. The community glue, it's for that community glue, which we all find is very, very difficult to articulate. Many books are trying to spell out what it is, this community glue, is actually very much a felt thing, and a performed thing as opposed to, and it's a process of learning as opposed to learning from, so which is why I haven't presented findings today that are saying this community is better than that community. I've done comparative research which is actually about building up a fuller picture of this becoming and this learning process as opposed to maybe discrete practices that we can borrow. But that's not to say that there aren't lessons and messages that are transferred to the mainstream from these eclectic communities and the previous two papers, because I think that sustaining a balance between individualism and collectivism is not a trivial challenge, but we do learn from these demonstration communities that these processes can be enduring, as 40 and 50-year-old in communities demonstrate very well. Thanks.